So thank you everyone for coming to hear me speak about this crucial case for all of us. And I think perhaps it's important for me to explain why it's so crucial at this point in time. We are almost exactly 3 weeks away from what could be Julian's final court hearing in the United Kingdom. And this is a process that has been going for a very long time. And depending on your understanding of the case, you might say it's been going since his arrest from the Ecuadorian embassy on the 11th of April, 2019. Or you might say it's been going since the 19th of June, 2012, when he entered the embassy, applied for political asylum, and obtained it. Or, as my timeline begins on the 7th of December, 2010, because that is the last day that Julian was a free man. On the 7th of December, 2010, exactly 1 week after WikiLeaks started publishing the US State Department cables, Julian was arrested in London. He was spent 10 days in Wandsworth Prison. He was then put under house arrest under extremely restrictive conditions. And then there was an extradition case in relation to a request from Sweden, which he lost in 2012, and then he entered the Ecuadorian embassy. There was a lengthy decision by the Ecuadorian government. The decision is actually public, and in it they say that they have reason to believe that if Julian is extradited to Sweden, there is a very serious risk that he will be extradited onwards to the United States in relation to the publications of WikiLeaks. And so in 2019, there was a change of government in Ecuador, and Julian was arrested by British police. In an extraordinary move, British police were invited into the Ecuadorian embassy to arrest a political asylee who had been given political asylum because there was a risk of torture and a politically motivated prosecution in the United States. And nevertheless, he was handed over to British authorities, who then put him in Belmarsh prison, where he's been for almost 5 years, without conviction, without charge in the UK, simply because the UK is holding Julian while the US tries to extradite him. So there has been a lengthy extradition process in the UK. Julian initially won against the US because the magistrate said that if he is extradited, he will be sent into custody, into extreme isolation, and that the conditions that he will be held under will essentially kill him, and therefore the UK should not extradite him. That was the initial decision. And then the US appealed. The High Court overturned the decision, and there is now a live extradition order for Julian to be extradited to the United States. He has sought permission to appeal. He was denied permission to appeal to the High Court, and now we are seeking for that decision to be reviewed. So that's the kind of the legal moment that we're at. But all this is very dry and procedural, but it's just to explain to you why we are at such a critical point. Because if this is when the British courts ultimately decide whether Julian is extradited or not. So how did we get here? What is Julian actually accused of? What did WikiLeaks do for the United States to attempt to prosecute a publisher for the very first time under their Espionage Act? And what is that anyway? Actually, it's a really old trick. Because you can't say that you're going to prosecute journalists, you have to kind of dress it up somehow differently. But when you look at the allegations, the accusations against Julian, they are simply that Julian received information from a source, and that source is Chelsea Manning, and that he possessed this information that was unauthorized because it was US government documents that Chelsea Manning had sent to WikiLeaks, and that WikiLeaks then published them for the benefit of the public. And what were these documents? Well, they concerned the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan that were underway at the time. You can imagine these wars had been going on for about 7 years by then. I think maybe Iraq started in 2002 or 2003. And Afghanistan had been going since 2001, I believe. And by 2010, the interest in these wars was just not there. It wasn't very newsworthy. Many Iraqis were dying, many Afghans were dying, many US and British soldiers were dying, but it just wasn't very newsworthy. And the way the information was being reported was through embedded journalists, which meant that the journalists went to these wars and then they moved around with the troops. They saw what the troops wanted them to see. They went to briefings by the Pentagon spokesperson and so on, and didn't really understand what was going on because they didn't have the capacity or the access that these documents actually gave the public. And so these documents really were a breakthrough because they gave a high resolution understanding of what was actually happening on the ground, how many casualties there were, because according to the US military at the time, they said they weren't counting civilian casualties, but they actually were. And through the WikiLeaks documents, you had the records of 15,000 individual civilian casualties that had not been recognized by the US military, but was on their database, for example. And obviously, if you hold the information and you know that that information will be damaging to, for example, obtaining, renewing your budget, going into the new budgetary year in Congress and so on, you withhold it. And this leads to extraordinary corruption and also to increased loss of life, not only of the military personnel, obviously, who were on the ground, but huge numbers of civilians. So the most iconic of these publications from 2010 was a video called Collateral Murder, which I recommend you all see, because what it depicted was an undisputable war crime. It's taken from a military helicopter, an Apache helicopter. It's a viewfinder, and you see what the pilots and the gunners could see. They see a group of people. 2 of them are actually journalists on assignment for Reuters, and they are walking the streets of East Baghdad, and then the helicopter opens fire and kills this group of people, including one of the journalists initially. The other one is trying to crawl to safety and then tries to seek shelter, and then you see a van pull up, and that van was driven by a man who was taking his 2 children to school, and the van pulls up, 2 men come out of the van, they pick up the dying journalist, take him into the back of the van, and then the helicopter opens fire. and kills everyone inside except the 2 surviving children, who only survived because their father threw his body on top of them and saved their lives, even though they were severely injured, because of course these guns have bullets that are about this big and rip you apart. And you can see it from the video. You can just see how when they spray the bullets, you see the bodies basically disintegrating. So this video was, collateral murder was, to the Iraq War, what the picture of the little girl burnt with napalm is to the Vietnam War. I don't know if you're familiar with that picture, but it is basically the essence of the public conscience of a war is attached to this video of collateral murder, and it is the fact of opening fire onto rescuers who posed no threat whatsoever, who were just, trying to get a severely injured man to safety, to get help, and they were killed as well. The publications that Julian is indicted in relation to, the Iraq War, the Afghan War, Guantanamo Bay prison camp, which is what's in the news a lot when I was at university. It's basically the United States had was waging a war on terror, they called it, and they justified unconventional, as they called it, unconventional methods. They legalized torture. They found they wrote memos to legalize torture. Obviously, everyone knows there is no way to legalize torture, but there was a rationalization internally for the administration to legalize torture in their own, according what they were licensing themselves to do, and also to keep people indefinitely detained, arbitrarily detained in prison camps, black sites in the Middle East, and then Guantanamo Bay, which is essentially basically a black site where torture was inflicted on the prisoners and so on. And there's still some prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. I think it's been open for 20 years now. Many of them have been released without charge after over a decade in there. There are a couple of very good books written by some of the prisoners. Mohamedou al-Salahi has written a very good book. I've met him. He's incredibly articulate, extremely smart guy. And there was a film about him. It's called anyway, the Mauritanian, that's it. I recommend that. And so WikiLeaks published the list of detainees that were in Guantanamo Bay, because it was so there was so much secrecy around Guantanamo Bay that the US didn't even name its prisoners. There was a PR effort around Guantanamo Bay. They allowed journalists to come in when they were finally allowed in. And the pictures that came out were of hooded men in orange jumpsuits, wearing eye coverings and earmuffs and stuff. So you had no idea who these people were. And they wouldn't release their names. They had prison numbers. So WikiLeaks published the detainee assessment briefs, they're called, of Guantanamo Bay. And this allowed the defense attorneys who were eventually allowed to defend some of these prisoners to be able to track, for example, if there had been evidence obtained through torture through another prisoner that incriminated their client, they could then use that information. But obviously, if everything is shrouded in secrecy, you're not able to mount an effective defense. So the defense attorneys of some of the Guantanamo Bay detainees were extremely happy when WikiLeaks published the list of detainees. Then there was the State Department cables, and this is perhaps the most interesting for you as students, because what it is basically a record of contemporary history, as close as we get to it, unvarnished. The actual analysis of the US State Department, of embassies, sending their reports from countries around the world back to the United States State Department. And it concerns, well, every country in the world, really. The range is from around 2003 to 2010, and it revealed things like how European countries were participating in the CIA rendition program, how the US Embassy was lobbying for big US corporations like Monsanto to undermine regulation in the European Union of crops that were imported and grown in the European Union, orders to spy on diplomats at the UN General Assembly headquarters, plans to sabotage the investigations into cases which involved US military personnel. So, for example, there's a case in Spain, a journalist called José Couso, and in 2003 he was reporting from Baghdad on the invasion, and he was reporting from a very famous hotel. I think it was called Hotel Palestine, and a US tank shelled the hotel and was basically aiming at this journalist and another journalist who were filming from the balcony. It's very clear that this was a targeted attack, and they both lost their lives. I think other journalists were also injured. And Spain then opened an inquiry because there was a lot of journalists staying at this hotel who had witnessed what had happened, how their colleague had been killed. And so a Spanish judge then opened an investigation. And from these cables, you see how the US Embassy is lobbying the Spanish Foreign Ministry to shut down the investigation. And obviously this is a foreign power interfering in the judicial process of a European ally. This is very serious stuff. And this is the kind of thing that you never really get to see unless it is through a leak, through a whistleblower who sees illegality, who sees corruption, who sees something that needs to be known by the public, and who then gives it to a publisher who is willing to publish. Now, this latter part, a publisher who is willing to publish, this is what is really at stake in Julian's case. Because what is being done to Julian is to, for the very first time, bring a case that criminalizes the act of receiving and making public information that is undeniably in the public interest. There is no question that what WikiLeaks published was in the public interest. Julian has won dozens of awards. We've just put up a tool actually called the Free Julian Assange Interactive Map. It's not a very sexy title, I'm afraid, but you can look it up. And it has all the awards Julian's been given, and also other honors. So, for example, about 20 journalistic unions in the European space, so Hungary and Greece, and also the National Union of Journalists here in the UK, in France and Germany and so on, have made Julian a member or honorary member as an act of solidarity, because the journalists really understand the gravity of the situation. The case that has been brought against Julian, when you truly understand it, it really boggles the mind. Julian is Australian. He was born and lived in Australia until he was about 30. And he came to Europe to publish. Well, he came to Europe and started WikiLeaks, and he came to the UK because he was publishing in partnership with The Guardian. The Guardian invited him to the UK. He was working with them in their offices in King's Cross in London, and also with Der Spiegel and Le Monde and El País and so on, in relation to these Chelsea Manning publications. So he's Australian. He was in the UK at the time of these publications. And the United States says that it can apply its Espionage Act legislation to an Australian in the UK for publishing information that is in the public interest. And they say they can do that because their espionage laws apply to anyone. You don't have to be American, you don't have to be in the United States. And this is clearly an abuse of their criminal statutes. It's also sending a signal to journalists around the world that if you publish about US state crimes, they will come after you. Of course, this would have no purchase if the country, in this case the UK, wouldn't allow it. The problem, of course, is that so far the United Kingdom has gone along with it, and in so doing has put not just Julian in danger, but press freedom here in danger too, because when you think about it, what does press freedom even mean if you can have a foreign country, the United States or any other? Because when you have a case like the one that is being brought today against Julian, it's also setting a new political reality, which any state can say, well, we have secrecy laws that also apply extraterritorially. They apply to non-citizens. So, for example, Turkey could say, well, you know, a journalist writing for the Mirror, reporting on something that happened in Turkey that they dislike, can be extradited to Turkey and faces a life sentence. And not only that, because they're not Turkish, they don't have any constitutional rights. This is the absurdity of Julian's case, because the United States isn't just applying its Espionage Act extraterritorially to a foreigner in the UK. It has also argued during the extradition hearing that because Julian is not a US citizen and he was not in the United States, First Amendment protections do not apply. The First Amendment is the free speech protections in the United States. It is an absurd proposition. Imagine a country applying their laws extraterritorially and not their protections. So the case itself is a complete abuse, an absurdity, clearly political. Any case that punishes a person in connection with publication of true information has a political dimension. But of course, you couldn't imagine a more political dimension than reporting on concealed facts in relation to an ongoing conflict. The UK courts have every reason to stop this extradition, but I'll tell you one very clear one. After Julian's initial extradition hearing, there was a report, 7,000-word report, coming out of Washington, D.C. And this report was written by 3 national security reporters, very established, and they had been working on this story for a long time, and they had over 30 sources. And some of them were anonymous, but some of them were also named. And these sources were in the CIA and the National Security Council, in the United States government during the Trump era. And what the story said was that the CIA head, a man called Mike Pompeo, from Kansas, he was obsessed with shutting down WikiLeaks and silencing Julian. And the way the report is written, and mind you, these are, the sources are insiders. They're people that are part of the CIA and national security establishment, said that basically Pompeo went rogue and was so obsessed with bringing down WikiLeaks, bringing down this publisher, that he ordered his underlings to develop what he called sketches and options about how to kill Julian. And that his assassination was discussed in the White House at the highest levels. Think of it. I mean, when we're talking about press freedom, what you have to understand is that press freedom is embarrassing in any democracy. Those in power are embarrassed by it. And it's very useful to go around and say, well, that country doesn't have press freedom, or this country doesn't have press freedom. But often it's used as a political tool to attack your enemies, because many allies of the United Kingdom also have very bad press freedom records. Saudi Arabia being one, for example, very clearly. Press freedom is kind of it's something that we need to try to obtain, but it's not a reality. It's certainly not a reality in this country, where you have a publisher in prison for almost 5 years for revealing war crimes, the British courts going along with it. In the United States, you have these reports that Pompeo has been engaged in a murder plot against Julian. And those murder plots got stopped somewhere along the line, but there was effectively a kidnap from the embassy. There has been an arbitrary detention in a UK prison of a publisher as a result of the same censorious and anti-democratic impulse that led Pompeo to seek to shut down WikiLeaks. The British courts obviously should not be going along with an extradition when there are undisputed reports that the country that is trying to extradite him was also trying to murder him a few years back under the Trump administration. But here we are. What you need to understand, this case is so unusual and strange because it is a political case. And if you miss that fact, then you won't understand anything. But if you understand that it's political, it all starts to fall into place. The courts are not immune to politics. That's a reality. And that's why we're also drawing as much attention as we can to the importance of Julian's case and the injustice of what is being done to him and the bigger picture that affects everyone, because ultimately it's the public's right to know. It's the ability to hold government to account, not just for past misdeeds, but for future misdeeds. And if you send the signal that there's no accountability, then it has the opposite effect, right? So we're nearing day X on the 20th and the 21st of February. Julian will obviously try to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights if he loses this round. But the fact is that it's a very dangerous moment in which Julian could be extradited within a very short period after a final decision if it's against him. And that's why it's so important for public awareness and public support at this point in time. And Julian's case is not a marginal case. You have all the major NGOs, Amnesty International and the Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders and so on, Human Rights Watch, any major human rights organization that you can think of, all the subject experts on press freedom understand that this case is extremely dangerous. It's authoritarian in its nature, and it has a very real effect on not just the ability of journalists to publish, but the public's ability to access true information, especially when it's embarrassing. So a lot is at stake. And we have a lot of grassroots support. In Italy, the city of Rome, for example, has made Julian an honorary citizen. Same with the city of Naples, and many other smaller towns as well, and medium-sized towns are in the process. He was shortlisted for the Sakharov Prize by the European Parliament last year. Think of that. I mean, you have a publisher, journalist in prison in the UK, and meanwhile the European Parliament says that this is one of the most important freedom of conscience, human rights cases of our times. Julian's continues to win awards every month almost. I'm traveling. I just went to Germany to collect the Konrad Wolf Award from the National Arts Academy, which has existed for like 200 years. So there's a lot of solidarity for Julian. At the UN General Assembly in September, the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, addressed the hall full of heads of state, and I don't know how long, it was like a 5-minute speech, and he said that Julian should be freed, and the leaders of the countries of the world, many of them then spontaneously started applauding. You don't get that with a case that isn't of some historical importance. Julian's case is of the highest importance. You have, whichever lens you look at it through, if you believe in the basic tenets of a democracy, then you have to support freeing my husband, because the alternative is a very dark place indeed, and that's where we are not just heading, but I would argue that's where we are. Thank you.
Right, okay, can you grab that other mic and see if it's working, because we'll probably give Stella one mic and then pass the other mic around. So, good?
Taking its time.
Hello? Yeah. Okay, right, so we'll give that one to Stella and then we'll pass the one around. Okay, so to begin my first question, I'd like to quote a section from Julian's autobiography, actually. A great number of those working for liberal causes are not only slightly shy, but borderline elusive. They want change to happen nicely, and it won't. They want decency to come about without anybody suffering or being embarrassed, and it won't. And most of all, they want to give many enemies of open government and the benefit open government the benefit of the doubt, and I don't. It's not just a difference of approach; it's a complete schism in our respective philosophy. In light of this, what does substantive and meaningful change look like, and how do we go about achieving it?
Well, I think I have to say about that book, it's actually unauthorized autobiography. It was a draft that the publisher then ran away with and has some problems with. But to your question, one of the many extremely bizarre things that Julian has had to endure, an unauthorized autobiography. All right. So I think the issue comes down to truth, and I think we're like in a there's a over the past few years, information has been problematized. That's because there are too many, because there is now a middlemen of different types that can can interfere with how information is transmitted and received. And once you're put in that powerful position where you can manipulate the channel between the speaker and the receiver, that's almost a temptation that's impossible to resist. So how do we break that down? I think the first thing is to understand that that is a reality. And since, I think, 2016, the idea of managing and curating information for the masses has become normalized. But at the same time, I think there's also a much more informed and demanding public, because there's increasing awareness that that is the case. You have a strange culture online, and I think, I guess basically online culture is what we're talking about generally, because that is how people interact, where there seems to be a lot of madness, and I think that madness has to do with a kind of a general detachment from reality. So how I think we need to always privilege the truth, even when it's painful, even when it's embarrassing. And I think that an attachment to accuracy and truth is what people need to aspire to, rather than looking good or appealing to, certain groups, which is basically, I think, what's driving a lot of this madness is trying to fit in. And fitting in, 10 years ago is different to fitting in nowadays. So I think, yes, in terms of the kind of liberal impulse to be nice, I think it's the same thing that is driving this kind of madness, that, people need to be encouraged to be bold and, speak their minds.
Okay, and for my second question, the United States often claims to be the defender of democracy, both at home and abroad. This version typified by Hillary Clinton's comments in 2010,
Sorry.
In 2010, in response to WikiLeaks' release of classified diplomatic cables, which claimed their release were an attack not only on America, but also on democracy itself. Do you believe that Julian and WikiLeaks attacked democracy, or has the United States government redefined democracy in order to weaponize it?
Well, I think the latter. One of the objections of the U.S. government, and the strongest objection of the U.S. government to WikiLeaks publications was basically its impact. And I think this is the real breakthrough that WikiLeaks made with journalism, is that it finally made it impactful. Yes, you have individual stories here and there that sometimes bring down, a minister or prime minister or government. But WikiLeaks really accelerated this by providing information that was official documents that corroborated illegality and corruption. Of course, it should have led to more prosecutions, it should have led to more policy changes and so on. But the fact that it exposed these things to the public, in a sense, was the greatest act of democratic accountability. The fact that the institutions didn't follow through is, a different issue, different problem. And so it was the highest point of transparency and openness, which is why there has been such a backlash. And we've really gone backwards in that respect. There's a lot. Government has become a lot more powerful. Surveillance has become, ubiquitous, and you have a corresponding diminishing of rights by individuals, by citizens, and so on. So the only true antidote is to have a very strong press, to have very strong transparency when you have such powerful states and corporations who are mining our privacy, our thoughts, our behavior. But unfortunately, and this is partly what Julian's imprisonment serves, instead of a stronger citizenry, we have a weaker citizenry and more authoritarian government. And that's just accelerating.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass on to the Hello. Yeah, cool. I just wanted to ask you about surveillance. So on the bio that your team actually sent to us, there was a claim that you and your family, I think, had illegal surveillance targeted to you. So I just wanted to ask you, can you just explain how that was illegal and basically what happened, just to kind of fill us all in.
Okay, so this is quite a fascinating aspect of Julian's case. And we only learned about it, well, we suspected quite a bit, but we only really learned about it after Julian's arrest. So after Julian was arrested, 3 individuals who had been working inside the embassy as part of the security company inside the embassy, then came forward. They went to El País, which is like the Times here, and they said that they had been involved in an illegal operation against Julian and his lawyers and his family and so on, and that they wanted to provide information. So El País broke the story, and then the Spanish police got involved. And So there's surveillance, which is kind of it's just a reality, but there's also a type of surveillance that crosses the line. For example, you're never allowed to monitor the privileged conversations between attorney-client. That is obvious because you are then interfering with a person's ability to defend themselves legally. One of the things that the security company was targeting was Julian's legal meetings. And another thing that crossed the line was that they had the instruction to obtain the DNA of our baby at the time, 6 months old, that they were instructed to steal a soiled nappy in order to do a DNA analysis. We know this because these whistleblowers went to El País, and then they went to the police, and then there was a raid at the headquarters of this security company, and they obtained hard drives, which evidenced what these people were saying. There were meetings with Julian's lawyers, there was correspondence, and so on. So this is a quite incredible amount of detail that we have of the illegal operations. I mean, you know, like, Julian hasn't done anything wrong. He published truthful information that evidenced US war crimes and cover-ups and so on. But there has been criminality in this case against Julian and against his lawyers, against our child, and so on. And this, of course, came out before we found out about the Pompeo CIA plot. One of the things that the whistleblowers explained was that they were actually secretly working for US intelligence, and that these instructions were not coming from Ecuador, they were coming from the United States, or as they put it, the dark side that they had passed over to. They had a lot of Star Wars references in their emails. So, you know, I think this is partly why the case of Julian is so fascinating, because you never really get this kind of detail. We've only got this kind of detail because there are whistleblowers in Spain, there are people willing to speak to these 3 reporters in the US because they viewed the way the CIA under Pompeo was treating Julian as extremely controversial and, you know, beyond the pale. And so that's why they then spoke to reporters. So this is the thing. This case is rife with illegality, but on the side of the persecutors. It's a political persecution, a very modern political persecution, unfortunately, in which the UK has had some degree of complicity.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to open it up to questions. So maybe we can start from the front and go back just to make it easier for the mic. So
thank you, Stella. Very enlightening and my question is about open source intelligence in recent years. So in the 2010s, the open source group Bellingcat was active in the east of Ukraine. And most notably in 2014, they released an investigation pertaining to the shoot down of the Malaysia Airlines flights over Donbass. I was wondering, given that much of the case, I think that the US raises, never mind the legality, rests on handling of classified information, on acquiring that classified information. I was wondering if, in our day and age, investigators risk less than Julian does, that Julian did back in his day, because so much of it is available, I guess, more freely.
I don't know that it, maybe, yeah, I mean, yes, there is much more information, I guess, that is, I think there's a lot of information that there's, how to put this, a lot of, it's a very convenient thing to be able to supply information to reporters that are willing to report it when it advances a certain agenda. But I mean, I think this isn't a moral thing to me. The thing is it true? Is it important? Has it got newsworthiness? This is what matters. Now, in relation to WikiLeaks, there were a lot of attacks alleging, the source was this or that. The way WikiLeaks is built is that it doesn't know who its sources are, but it verifies. And that's why WikiLeaks has 100% accuracy in its publications, because it has a very very good verification process. And we know that there have been attempts to trick WikiLeaks into publishing false information, because we've seen there have been plans leaked from 2011. There's a plan, what was it called? Anyway, there's a 2011 plan about how to take down WikiLeaks. One of the things was send it false information, which will discredit the organization. The reality is that the press has always been a means through which to push information, and it happens every day. Even the kind of legacy press publishes classified information on a daily basis. You don't think about it, but often it's pushed by the government itself in an authorized leak. Sometimes it is pushed by someone who disagrees with a policy and then goes and talks to a journalist. This is part of the process of democratic accountability, and that is why journalists are protected, because although the sources may be violating their contract, or in some cases may be formally violating the law, if the information is important, if it is of public interest, if it's newsworthy, the journalist must publish it. This should be the standard. And that is the standard that WikiLeaks has stated on its website. It's cited in the indictment information of political, diplomatic, historical, legal importance. That is the criteria. And more accurate information out there is a good thing for the public, that there be lots of true information out there so that the public can assess. It shouldn't be, it's a whole different story if you're talking about false information or fabrications, of which there have been many, including against Julian. But when we're talking about newsworthy, true information, and that there's been a proliferation of organizations who analyze that kind of information, it's a good thing in general, but it's also true that as a member of the public, you have to be nuanced and understand, yes, this may be true. Who might be interested in publishing it? I mean, in this being out there, and that's not a reason to censor it. It's just being discerning and understanding that information. There are usually always motivations to have information out, always. And you read the Times or the Guardian, and that's how you should read regular newspapers as well. Why now? Why this? What else is going on? Who's saying it?
Thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, since you mentioned that the United States is trying to charge Julian under the Espionage Act, even though he's never been there or kind of worked there or anything like that, and he's not a US citizen, if there's any legal precedent of a country trying to do that to someone beforehand that you could draw on?
Well, he has been to the United States briefly, in the 90s, and also, anyway, he's traveled through the United States. He's never lived there, and he was here when he was publishing. I think this is it's so absurd that if anyone has come up with it previously, it just wouldn't fly. And it doesn't fly legally. It's just that it comes from the superpower, the biggest superpower, although, okay, maybe there's more than one now, but it's because it's the United States, it's because it's a close ally to the United Kingdom that this has even reached this point. If this had been, I was just speaking to, I won't say who, but an official from a major European country just today, and they were saying this would never happen in our country. Would never even had gone to trial, would have been thrown out the moment the extradition warrant came through. It's just too beyond the pale. So that's the political reality is why Julian's, in the prison. Espionage laws have been used against journalists domestically for a very long time, and other political offenses like treason. You publish something nasty about the king, well, then you're a traitor. They never say we're accusing you of journalism. It just looks bad, but that's what it is. There's no allegation that Julian published on, that he was. You see, you often see when it's reported accused of espionage. He's accused under the Espionage Act, but the Espionage Act in the US is from 1917. It was passed during the First World War. It was applied to conscientious objectors who didn't want the US to participate. It was a political tool to begin with. And it was used against actual spies during the Cold War. It was never used against a publisher. But this really changed during the Obama administration. The Obama administration, on the one hand, has a soft look, but in reality, Obama had Kill Thursdays, I think they would call it, when they would all get together in a room and watch the extrajudicial assassination of a list of people that they had on their kill list. That's widely reported. So this benign reputation that the Obama administration had is not accurate. And another aspect that was very a real shift under Obama was the prosecution of sources under the Espionage Act. So it was a gradual shift. Chelsea Manning was prosecuted during the Obama years in relation to the publication by WikiLeaks. But that was the source, right? Chelsea Manning was a US military analyst who had access to this information and sent it to WikiLeaks. By the way, Louis Theroux did an interview with Chelsea Manning, which is on the BBC iPlayer, which is very interesting. And she explains her motivations and so on. So she went to prison. She was sentenced to 35 years for these documents, for giving these documents to WikiLeaks. But then there were other people like John Kiriakou, CIA officer who had been in the CIA for something like 20 years. And he gave information about the torture program to a journalist. And he was prosecuted under the Espionage Act for disclosing state secrets. He's the only person in the US who has been convicted for torture. in relation to the US torture program. He wasn't actually doing the torturing, but he talked about it to a journalist, and he was put in prison. So there were 3 times more prosecutions than all previous administrations combined under the Espionage, not for Espionage Act, not for espionage, but in connection with news gathering, so sources. The shift then came with Trump, and of course Trump, you guys are very young, but the Trump administration had a seriously bad relationship with the press because there were a lot of leaks from within his administration. He had said some crazy things about like killing leakers and so on, and he wanted to set a deterrent, and Pompeo was lobbying for Julian to be the deterrent, and that's why this prosecution started under the Trump administration. It was brought in 2017, end of 2017, 2018. It was sealed, so the UK was aware that the US wanted to extradite him in relation to these publications for a whole year before he was arrested. There was this, and you still see it in the reporting now, like completely disconnected, as if the UK had no idea. But the UK authorities knew that the US had set in motion Julian's extradition while he was still in the embassy, and pretended it had to do with a bail violation for when he went into the embassy. But this is really unprecedented, bringing an Espionage Act case against a publisher, and the actual accusations are receiving, possessing, and communicating information to the public.
All right, so yeah, before you take a seat, Stella, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming again. Before we're going to have dinner, do the closing announcements, but yeah, please give this stand a big round of applause.